What if the only person trying to clean up the system was the first person buried by it? How many lives are destroyed, not by those who commit the crime, but by those who dare reveal the truth? This is not a story about a criminal, but about a man who deeply believed in justice until he realized that it was just an illusion. Ricardo Mota was an example of discipline, honor, and loyalty. A decorated former military officer, he was handpicked by a federal agency to fulfill a mission that few would accept: infiltrate one of the most corrupt police forces in the country. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he believed he was doing the right thing. He believed that in the end, he would be recognized as a hero. But what he didn't know is that the system itself would put him in the villain's place. In the first few months, Ricardo did what few would have the courage to do. He lived with criminals wearing uniforms, participated in armed operations that ended in extortion, heard conversations that seemed like something out of a movie, but were real. And he recorded everything. Carefully, he recorded audio, hid documents, noted details in reports that only he and his superiors should have access to. Each step taken was an attempt to unmask a web of corruption that involved not only police officers, but also business people, politicians, and even judges. He believed that when he presented the evidence, the country would see the truth. But the truth in that system was the last thing they wanted to see. When he finally delivered the complete report with names, accounts, dates, and indisputable evidence, there was absolute silence. Nobody responded. Days later, his files mysteriously disappeared. The superiors disappeared. Colleagues who previously treated him with respect began to avoid him. And then, like a nightmare without warning, the turning point. Ricardo was accused of being the leader of the gang he himself was investigating. The recordings were edited, the audio distorted, and he was arrested on charges of commanding the crime he tried to destroy. In the blink of an eye, the undercover agent became a high-ranking criminal. The media bought the narrative. Justice closed its eyes, and the people judged without knowing the truth. But what no one knew was that this story was far from over. Because even inside prison, treated as a traitor, attacked and isolated, Ricardo never gave up. And the truth he so carefully recorded still existed somewhere, waiting to be discovered. What really happened? How did a hero become a defendant? And the most frightening thing, how many more innocent people are paying for daring to confront corruption from within the system? If this story touched you in any way, if you've ever felt the weight of being judged unfairly, or know someone who was silenced for trying to do the right thing, then this channel is for you. Leave your like now and subscribe so you don't miss any truth that the system tried to hide. Here, each story is a fight against oblivion, and your presence here makes all the difference. Before putting on a police uniform and becoming the face of a secret mission, Ricardo Mota was just one name among many others. A respected former soldier, decorated for bravery in the field, known among his colleagues for his unshakable integrity and sense of justice that often went beyond the limits of hierarchy. He was not driven by ambition, but by a deep conviction that the right thing must be done, whatever the cost. And it was precisely this conviction that made him the ideal candidate for a mission that no one else would accept. When federal intelligence agents came to him, they said the country needed someone with courage, someone willing to enter hell and not be corrupted by the flames. Ricardo accepted without hesitation. He believed he was on the right side of history. He believed he would have the support of the authorities, the law, and the truth. But what he didn't know is that, by accepting this mission, he wasn't being sent as a hero. It was being offered as a sacrifice. The mission was clear: infiltrate one of the most feared and corrupt battalions in the country, where extortion, disappearances, and schemes with militias were handled naturally within the corridors of the police station. Ricardo presented himself as a new street officer, someone willing to be part of the rotten wheels of that system. He smiled, pretended to accept bribes, participated in armed Operations that would never be recorded, and all of this with a single objective: to collect evidence. Every recorded conversation, every captured image, every hidden document was sent through secure channels to the superiors who had promised to protect it. For months, he lived as an undercover, sharing his daily life with criminals in uniform, living with men who laughed while committing atrocities. At night, alone, he wrote reports with the most disturbing details. And even so, I believed that everything would be worth it when the truth came out. The problem is that Ricardo trusted the system too much. He believed there was a line that not even corruption would dare cross, that there was a limit, a point at which the truth would be greater than any power play. But that line didn't exist. He didn't know that while he was risking his life trying to unmask those men, he was being watched by those who had sent him. He didn't know that his reports were being blocked, that his superiors were more interested in protecting political alliances than ensuring justice. And so, without realizing it, Ricardo began to dig his own grave within a structure that saw him as a threat, not as a hero. Everything he recorded, everything he reported, was silently hushed up. And when he finally thought it was time to act, to tear down the house of cards, he discovered in the cruelest way possible that he was alone. And from that moment on, his life would never be the same. Ricardo was moved to one of the most dangerous and neglected areas of the country, a territory where the police uniform did not represent safety, but fear. The battalion he was transferred to was known for its dark reputation: involvement with armed militias, extortion from traders, manipulation of investigations, extrajudicial executions, and a network of silence that made any attempt to report disappear into thin air like dust. There, the truth was worthless. Corruption was institutionalized, treated as part of routine. The most feared officers were not those who followed the law, but those who knew how to use it to their advantage, to protect themselves while committing the most cruel crimes. And in this suffocating scenario, Ricardo had to blend in. He needed to leave the honorable soldier behind and step into the shoes of an unscrupulous man, without, however, losing the essence of who he was. The mission required more than courage. It required coolness, emotional intelligence, and above all, sacrifice. Ricardo began to participate in the actions as if he were one of them. Night operations without official registration, visits to neighborhoods controlled by armed groups where, instead of protecting the population, police collected contributions from terrified traders, seized cars that never arrived at the police station, disappearances of people who had asked too many questions, and, most perversely, private parties organized by commanders with dirty money, filled with luxury and impunity. He lived all of this inside, and at the same time, he recorded in silence, recording conversations hidden with a micro-device sewn into the lining of his uniform, photographing documents, memorizing names, times, places. Each piece of information was carefully organized and sent in confidential reports to the Federal Intelligence Corps that had assigned him to the mission. On the outside, he was what everyone saw, a police officer who fit perfectly into that rotten system. He smiled at corrupt superiors, clashed with subordinates who questioned orders, participated in violent games in the barracks. Inside, he was a man in constant conflict, living on the edge of the abyss, living daily with the fear of being discovered. With any mistake, he could die, not in combat, but at the hands of those who should have been his colleagues in uniform. His mission was like walking inside a maze with no way out, where each step was a choice between life and death, between continuing to gather evidence or giving up everything to save his own skin. But Ricardo didn't stop. He believed that in the end, when he delivered the complete dossier with all the names and crimes recorded, the system would act. He believed that justice would prevail. Little did he know that while he was fighting in the dark, the real monsters were already turning out the lights. After months of living among wolves, Ricardo finally gathered everything he needed: a meticulous dossier with names, dates, locations, and indisputable audio and video records. He left no loose ends. Each illicit transaction was linked to a specific bank account. Each squad leader involved had their role documented. The most compromising conversations, including those made via internal radio and seemingly harmless phone calls, were all there in encrypted files sent directly to the headquarters of the agency that recruited him. He believed this was the turning point, that within hours, helicopters would fly over the barracks, prosecutors would appear with arrest warrants, and the culprits would be handcuffed in front of the cameras. He had accomplished his mission. He risked everything. Now, we just had to wait for the return. But what came was silence. A brutal, suspicious, almost deafening silence. Days passed with no response, no returns, no confirmation of receipt. Ricardo tried to contact his supervisors, but the numbers were inactive. Encrypted messages did not even acknowledge receipt. It was as if, suddenly, everything had ceased to exist. Then something worse started to happen. One by one, the contacts he used within the agency disappeared. People who were always discreet but trustworthy disappeared. And it wasn't long before rumors began to circulate in the battalion's corridors. There is a traitor among us. Someone has been delivering heavy stuff. Intelligence is tracking one of our own. Ricardo listened to all this with his head down, trying to keep his mask on. But inside he already knew. The operation had been buried, and now he was the new target. The following week, upon arriving at the accommodation, Ricardo realized that something was wrong. His closet was broken into. Your belongings rummaged through. The notebook where he kept copies of the tests was missing. In its place, a scrawled note: "You dug your own grave." The following day, he was summoned to the Internal Affairs Department. Not as a witness, but how suspicious. They said he had infiltrated the battalion to organize illegal schemes, who used his military experience to take control of corruption. The evidence he himself had collected, edited, was presented as evidence against him. The audio was cut. The images were out of context. The same documents that denounced the system now incriminated it. He tried to react, tried to explain, but it was no use. It was him against something much bigger. Ricardo, who believed he was taking part in a noble mission, was now treated as the mentor of a gang. The system didn't just betray him. The system erased your truth and turned the hero into the perfect villain. It was on a cold and stuffy morning, one of those mornings where the air seems too heavy to breathe, that Ricardo received the call. A colleague from the Internal Affairs Department, someone with whom I had already exchanged quick words in the institution's corridors, asked to speak in a discreet way. The tone of the voice was strange, a mix of pity and warning. They found themselves in an isolated room, where the windows seemed purposefully closed to prevent any real breath from escaping. And there, with the door locked and a deafening silence, the warning came straight out. The allegations have leaked, and now they're saying you're the mastermind behind everything. For a moment, Ricardo thought it was a joke, a bad joke, but there was no smile on his colleague's face, just a defeated look from someone who already knew that the machine was moving and could no longer be stopped. He who was the whistleblower was now the main target of the investigation. The evidence he himself risked his life to deliver was being re-edited, distorted, turned against him like sharp blades. Documents appeared with his forged signature. Recordings were manipulated, taken out of context, presented as if he was giving orders and not collecting evidence. Carefully selected images from internal cameras showed him entering and leaving rooms that, until then, were accessed by the entire team. But in the final report, this became suspicious movements. The Internal Affairs report was being prepared to destroy it. And the most revolting thing, no one was talking about the truly corrupt people anymore. No commander was called to testify. No bank accounts were investigated. The focus now was Ricardo. He had become the #1 enemy of the very institution that sent him on that mission. In the days that followed, the atmosphere changed. The looks from colleagues were no longer one of respect or camaraderie. They were hard, cold looks of silent judgment. Some avoided him in the hallways. Others whispered behind his back, as if he were a threat ready to explode. Ricardo began to feel the weight of institutional loneliness, abandonment of the system. He tried to contact his original superiors, but every email was returned with an error. The phones were off. People he had met before seemed to have evaporated. The agency that recruited him had disappeared. Or, worse, was pretending he never existed. And meanwhile, the case against him gained speed. What was supposed to be a secret operation against a group of corrupt police officers turned into a public manhunt to burn the name of a man who dared to do the right thing. And deep down, Ricardo already felt this was just the beginning of the hell that awaited him. If you've made it this far, tell me one thing honestly. What would you do if you knew that the system that was supposed to protect you was destroying you from the inside? Do you think someone like Ricardo deserved to be silenced for trying to do right? Comment below. I would not remain silent if you also believe that the truth must be exposed, no matter the price. Your voice matters, and it could be exactly what keeps this story alive until the end. The cell where Ricardo was thrown was not just made of concrete and iron bars, it was made of silence, abandonment, and betrayal. The instant the iron door closed behind him, the world outside simply erased his existence. Without the right to visits, without contact with trusted lawyers, without access to the process itself, he began to live like a ghost within a system that he himself had tried to save. The official justification was protection, but the reality was cruel isolation, calculated to stifle any attempt at defense. The reports he had sent disappeared from the files. The original audios are gone, the digital copies deleted. It was as if Ricardo Mota had never tried to prevent anything, as if everything he had done was just an act to protect his own interests, as they now claimed. Meanwhile, his former colleagues, those truly involved, remained free, comfortable in their positions, laughing in the corridors where Ricardo once walked, believing he was on the right side. The system he believed he defended now spat out his name like that of a traitor. Headlines repeated that he was the mastermind behind one of the biggest corruption schemes in police history. But no one showed proof because they didn't exist. They were replaced by distorted versions, edited montages, manipulated fragments that made a hero a villain. And there, in that damp and dark cubicle, with time dragging like an invisible sentence, Ricardo wondered if the truth would ever have enough strength to break the walls of silence, because all that was left now was to survive and wait. While Ricardo faced the crushing loneliness of his cell outside, his reputation was meticulously destroyed by invisible hands, skilled in manipulating the truth. The media, which had once exalted him as a hero in risky operations, now portrayed him as the corporation's biggest traitor. Selective leaks began to emerge, cut audio, images taken out of context, records altered. Excerpts in which Ricardo discussed operations Undercover were presented as confessions. The tone of the press changed overnight. Exemplary police officer was crime leader appeared on the front pages of the newspapers, as if his conviction was already a fact. Specialists on duty analyzed him on TV shows, saying that he was always too ambitious, too quiet, too cold, as if that were enough to justify an arrest. His family became a target. His wife, a respected teacher, was fired after receiving anonymous threats. Their children began to be persecuted at school, labeled the criminal's children. Close friends disappeared. Colleagues in uniform who once swore loyalty pretended not to know him. And he, locked in silence, was forced to watch everything on prison television without the right to respond. No right to the truth. Public opinion, hungry for scandals, had already judged and condemned him. It didn't matter what came next. The damage was already done. The name Ricardo Mota had become synonymous with corruption, even though he was, in fact, the only honest piece in that entire rotten system. The cruelest blow did not come from the sentence of formal justice, but from the popular sentence, being erased as a man, as a father, as a citizen, and rewritten as a villain. Judgment Day arrived enveloped in an atmosphere of spectacle, not justice. Cameras surrounded the courtroom, sensationalist headlines ran on the broadcasters' baseboards, and the packed room looked more like an arena ready to sacrifice an already convicted defendant. Ricardo, still with a firm face, had in his eyes the frustration of someone who knew the truth but could no longer prove it. None of the original recordings, those that contained the compromising dialogues, the names, the account numbers, the direct orders from superiors, were admitted as evidence. The prosecution alleged technical failures, while the judges accepted the manipulated clippings as absolute truths. The defense lawyers, restrained from the first steps, were silenced with glares, veiled threats, and even intimidation outside the courtroom. Ricardo no longer had allies. When he tried to speak out, the judge interrupted him. When he looked at the jury, he saw only tired, detached faces, ready to throw off the weight of this case. And then the sentence fell like a blade. 25 years in prison for corruption, criminal organization, and money laundering. No appeal, no truce, no room for doubt. While he was handcuffed in front of the cameras, amidst the flashes that recorded his ruin, his eyes met those of the real culprits, sitting in the front row, in impeccable suits, smiling discreetly. They knew. Everyone there knew, and yet the truth was buried once again, because in that court justice was just a fancy word written on the wall. The system didn't need heroes, it needed silence. And Ricardo had dared to speak. Now, answer me honestly. If you had seen this scene, with the real culprit smiling in the front row while an innocent man was dragged away like a criminal, what would you feel? Anger, impotence, revolt? Write the word here in the comments, unfair, if it touched you in any way. I want to know how many people still care about the truth, because as long as we don't talk about it, silence will continue to win. Inside the cold cell of a maximum security prison, where light barely enters and time seems to have stopped, Ricardo Mota became just another number. But to the other inmates, he was much more than that. He was a police officer, and in that hostile environment, that meant having a target on your back 24 hours a day. There wasn't a day that went by that he didn't receive threats whispered through the corridors, looks full of hatred, subtle provocations that announced that at any moment his life could be taken. He couldn't trust anyone, not even prison guards. Some treated him with contempt, others with cruel indifference. The isolation wasn't just physical, it was psychological, as if his very existence was being slowly erased. The nights were the hardest times. While the early morning silence was broken by distant screams and metallic bangs, Ricardo lay down on the dirty mattress and looked at the cracked ceiling, trying to organize in his mind every detail of the mission that took him there. It was as if remembering was the only way to keep alive the certainty that he wasn't crazy, that all that really happened. It was in this void that he began to write, using a pen he had hidden in the library and pages torn from old books. He began to record his story, every name, every order received, every illegal operation he witnessed. It was his only weapon, your only scream. A diary hidden inside the fake cover of a forgotten novel, guarded as if it were gold. Ricardo also wrote letters, hundreds of them, addressed to journalists, justice bodies, lawyers, prosecutors, politicians. But no response came. It was like screaming into an abyss. The feeling of abandonment was so strong that at certain moments he wondered if there was still someone out there who remembered his name. But still he continued. Writing was his way of resisting. his way of telling himself that he wouldn't give up on proving the truth, because as long as he was alive, as long as he had the strength to breathe in that place where hope does not survive, he would never accept being called guilty for a crime he never committed. And it was in this silence, in this environment where everything seemed to be lost, that something began to change. Little details that seemed inconsequential began to fall into place. Rumors in the corridors, different. Looks from the agents, a strange movement towards the prison. Ricardo didn't know it yet, but outside a spark had been lit. Something or someone was about to find his hidden words, and that story buried between the bars was perhaps about to emerge from the darkness. What Ricardo never imagined was that, on the other side of the bars, far from the echo of screams and the cold iron that imprisoned him, a forgotten copy, a small digital file that survived systematic erasure, was about to rekindle the flame of truth. It was just a fragment, an undeleted backup, stored by mistake on an old intelligence server. And it was there that a young federal investigator named Davi Cardoso stumbled upon it by chance during a routine audit. But what David found was far from routine. Encrypted audios, coded documents, entire recordings of compromising conversations with names that could never have appeared together in an official report. Delegates, prosecutors, politicians, figures beyond suspicion, all naturally mentioned in schemes that involved bribery, extortion, and silencing of witnesses. David was in shock. He was new, idealistic, one of those who still believed in justice as a mission and not as a facade. When crossing the backup information with old files from Ricardo Mota's process, he felt his stomach drop. This was not just a miscarriage of justice, it was an institutionalized crime, designed to destroy a life and preserve the status of a corrupt elite. Line by line, Davy checked each recording. There were the voices of the real culprits, the orders to erase evidence, the plans to turn Ricardo into a scapegoat. And the most shocking thing, the data matched exactly the report that Ricardo claimed to have sent years before, the same one that mysteriously disappeared before his arrest. The farce was falling apart, not by the will of the system, but by an error, a digital breach that escaped the control of those who thought they were untouchable. David knew that from that moment on, he was playing a dangerous game. Exposing that meant touching names that had been dictating rules in the shadows for years. But he also knew he couldn't ignore what he had in hand. Each file was a cry for help that had been silenced. Each recording was concrete proof that Ricardo had been buried alive to protect a criminal network that extended across all spheres of power. With shaking hands and a racing heart, Davi began to put together a new dossier. This time, impossible to delete. But he needed more than documents. I needed voices, of media, of exposure. And that's when he looked for a journalist known for not keeping quiet in the face of any pressure. And what was about to happen would put not only Ricardo's innocence on the agenda, but also the Brazilian justice system itself in question. Because when the truth finds a channel, it becomes uncontrollable. And what came next, no one was prepared to face. Even with all the evidence revealed, with the audio restored, the documents reappearing like pieces of a puzzle that should never have been hidden, the system, in its bureaucratic coldness, resisted. The new legal team that took on Ricardo Mota's defense faced an almost insurmountable wall of institutional silence. The judges, who had once ruled on false evidence, now refused to admit error. They alleged technicalities, lack of protocol, procedural details. Any excuse served to avoid tarnishing their own name. Meanwhile, society began to wake up. Articles on independent channels, viral videos, podcasts, and investigations by honest journalists began to raise dust that time had failed to cover up. The hashtag #LibertemRicardo gained momentum. Voices that had previously been silent began to unite in a cry for real justice. But late justice carries the bitter taste of indifference. It was 11 years, 4,000 days in which Ricardo slept in a cell for a crime he never committed. 4,000 mornings when I woke up not knowing if I would make it out alive. And when the penitentiary door finally opened, there was no applause. There was no press conference, nor authorities waiting for him with excuses. Only one guard called him by name, handed over his aged belongings and pointed to the gate. He left in silence, with his eyes marked by time, his soul wounded inside. Not because he was released, but because no one at the top had the courage to say, "We made a mistake." No reparations were offered, no official apology, no acknowledgement of the suffering imposed. It was as if the state said, "You are free, and that is all." And outside, the world had changed. The city he knew kept spinning. People on the streets with cell phones in their hands, electric cars passing through new avenues, taller buildings, faces he didn't recognize. Time did not wait for Ricardo. He came out as a survivor of a war that no one wanted to admit existed. But even though he was injured, he walked with the same firmness as when he entered, because now, on the outside, with the truth finally out, what he carried was no longer just pain. It was the responsibility to expose a system that destroyed his life and that still destroyed the lives of many others who had no voice. The clock of justice may be slow, but once it starts moving in the right direction, no one can stop it. And Ricardo knew that his fight was far from over. Today, Ricardo Mota walks the streets as a free man, but not as someone who feels truly free. The freedom they gave him came too late, shrouded in silence, surrounded by omissions. He didn't smile easily again, nor did he find peace in simple routines. He lives away from the spotlight in a small town where few recognize him. He doesn't give interviews, doesn't participate in debates, avoids any mention of the name that once made headlines in every newspaper in the country. And perhaps this is the greatest weight he carries, that of having been used, discarded and forgotten by a system that should have protected him. But what many don't know is that during his years in prison, Ricardo wrote. He wrote with fury, with pain, with a memory of someone he could not forget. He wrote everything down. Every covert operation, every threat received, every veiled betrayal. He wrote about the secret meetings, the omitted codes, the names that should never have appeared on his mission orders. These pages, hidden for years in an old copy of The Prince, were rescued after his release and turned into a book. Not just a memoir, but a historical document, a living dossier, a printed cry from someone who decided not to remain silent even when the entire world did everything it could to silence him. The publication of the diary was like a bolt of lightning from a clear sky. He revealed not only the plot that incriminated him, but exposed the underground functioning of a network of power that crossed police stations, courts, political offices, and newspaper offices. Names started to drop. Investigations have been reopened. Previously untouchable figures began to be questioned. And even if they didn't admit it publicly, everyone who helped bury the truth knew that diary was living proof that the lie was never complete. That justice can be manipulated, yes, but that the memory of those who suffered is never completely erased. Ricardo's case became a symbol. In law universities, it is studied as a brutal example of systemic failure. In activist circles, his name is remembered as that of a modern martyr, someone who paid the highest price for trying to do right. On social media, there are still those who write "Justiça por Ricardo," even if time insists on pushing their story into the forgotten corners of the internet. Because deep down, what he represents goes beyond your individual pain. Ricardo is a living reminder that the system, when threatened by someone who carries the truth, responds with cruelty. And for this reason, even away from the public, even though he lives as a recluse and tired, Ricardo Mota continues to be an uncomfortable shadow for those who once benefited from his silence, a ghost that hovers over power, reminding everyone that the truth, when written with blood, sweat, and solitude, will never be forgotten. If this story has stuck with you so far, it's because you know how urgent it is to give a voice to those who have been silenced. So, if you believe that the truth deserves to be heard, and that stories like Ricardo's can no longer be forgotten, leave your like now and subscribe to the channel. This is not just support, it is resistance. And if you think this was strong, wait until you see what comes in the next video. There's a hidden truth waiting to be revealed, and you'll want to be here when it comes to light.